The HR director smiled like I'd just won an award. "It's not a demotion," she said, "just a strategic restructure. You'll still be integral to the team." But I'd seen the looks all week, the closed-door meetings that got quiet when I approached, emails marked confidential that used to CC me by default. Strategic, my ass. This was planned, and I was the last to know. My name is Marcus Toledo. I'm 38, and until recently I was the senior logistics analyst at a mid-sized distribution firm in Charlotte. For 6 straight years, I optimized every inch of our routing systems, updated our inventory tracking to an automated grid, cut delivery lag times by 37%, and kept us afloat during the worst shipping crunches of the last decade. My systems helped land 2 major clients. I believed in the work, and I genuinely thought I'd built something solid enough that they'd at least respect me. When I started, the warehouse crews didn't trust suits, and most white-collar staff stayed out of their way. But I spent my first 3 months working side by side with inventory runners, learning the process relay by relay. Eventually, they started coming to me with ideas, not complaints. I built that bridge. And on the office side, I did the same. I coached junior analysts, put together a knowledge-based system, hosted spreadsheet workshops no one asked for but everyone used. We had trivia Fridays in the break room with dumb prizes but real jokes. There were birthday donuts and shared Spotify lists. It felt like a place that worked because of the people, not just the profit. Which is why I let my guard down when they brought Ezra in. He was fresh out of UNC, bright-eyed, loud, and green in ways he didn't even realize. His resume had buzzwords but no scars. They introduced him as my logistics assistant, said he'd be shadowing for a while to learn the ropes. Fine, I figured. Everyone starts somewhere. I gave him the benefit of the doubt. Showed him the dashboard schematics I'd personally debugged, walked him through cost-benefit matrices I'd customized over years. He tripped over acronyms at first, asked naive questions that could have been solved with a quick search, but I was patient. I'd trained plenty of new hires over the years. I didn't hold their inexperience against them. But about 3 weeks in, I noticed Ezra's questions started getting oddly specific. Not how does this supply chain loop integrate with automation, but which vendor contacts did you personally negotiate with, and what margin decision logic do you use when prioritizing East Coast shipments? That had never been part of the standard training. He didn't want to learn the system, he was learning me, and that's when things started to change. I stopped getting invited to client dry runs. Project email chains I'd always owned started landing in my inbox without edit access. A monthly deliverables meeting I led for years, suddenly postponed indefinitely. Ezra, meanwhile, was getting chummy with Janine, our department head, as if they'd known each other longer than the timeline allowed. He started slipping my own phrases into team huddles like he'd coined them himself. When I'd mention upcoming risk assessments, he'd laugh and say, "Oh, I have that covered." He didn't. It built gradually like rust under paint. And then on Monday morning, I opened my calendar and saw it. Team restructuring update, mandatory attendance. I knew when I walked into the conference room, it felt like I was walking into my own eulogy. Ezra was already seated with that same damn note-taking tablet I gave him in week 1. Janine stood at the head of the table, deeply satisfied. "We've been reviewing process efficiencies," she began, "and we've realized we need to realign leadership to match a more forward-focused logistics model." They said Ezra had shown initiative and rapid adaptation. Then the kicker. "Marcus, your role is being adjusted to support transitional oversight. Nothing changes salary-wise, you'll just aid operations from a non-central position during this handoff period." Handoff? Like I was a clipboard they were passing down the bench. I smiled. Not because I felt anything close to joy, but because it was the only thing I could do other than scream. I thanked them for their honesty. I nodded through the phrases, team evolution, succession planning, leveraging generational insight. Not a single word about what I had built, protected, carried. Just new polish over an old knife. They gave me 90 days to train Ezra. They called it collaboration, but it was exile in disguise. Afterward, I left the room, stepped into the hall, and stood there for minutes I can't account for. I didn't cry, I didn't shout, I just stood there, silence roaring in my ears. No one followed me, no one asked if I was okay. Not even the junior staff I once bought lunch for when they hit quota targets. Their screens kept glowing, their inboxes pinging like nothing had happened. I reached into my coat pocket for my car keys and felt something else, a thumb drive I always carried, mostly out of habit. 2 years worth of back-end audit logs, ignored data, untouched reports. glitches I'd flagged, mistakes buried in meetings that were tabled indefinitely. Stuff no one looked at because they knew I would keep looking for them. And suddenly, I wasn't sure why I ever had. It started with Ezra getting oddly curious, not in a learning curve kind of way, but targeted, calculated. He began asking questions that had nothing to do with job performance and everything to do with job ownership. Why did you switch from Bexley Freight to Hanlon Logistics last year? What's your decision matrix for carrier prioritization on the East Coast? He wasn't building skill, he was building a profile. Mine. I caught it first during a route modeling session we were reviewing. Instead of asking which tags flagged incomplete handoffs, he asked which vendors personally escalate to me if there's a delay. That may sound innocent, but only the team lead needs that information, and he wasn't one. Soon after, the shift became more visible. Slowly, at first, subtle exclusions like meetings moved without notice or documents I authored being converted into new formats that, curiously, no longer bore my initials. Then came the carpet pulls. Ezra started delivering solo updates to Janine, standing confidently in meetings I was no longer invited to. He used my phrasing, talked through data lenses I'd introduced. Hearing your own language coming back to you dissolved of credit, that does something to a person, and none of it felt random. My access began to shrink. First drop was the Project Phoenix folder, then weekly metric syncs started landing in my inbox as PDFs, not shared sheets. I asked Janine more than once if something had changed structurally. She always smiled too tightly and said the team was just reorganizing streams for better clarity. Then came the calendar invite. Team restructuring update, mandatory attendance. By then, I knew exactly what was coming, but the knowing didn't soften the impact. That conference room had never felt colder. Janine stood at the front, eyes scanning for eye contact, landing everywhere but on mine. Ezra sat like a student eager for his gold star. Janine's voice was velvet when she said it. We've been exploring some forward-focused roles in logistics, and we're excited to bring fresh insight into the leadership framework. Then my name dropped not as praise, but as part of a transition plan. You'll be reassigned to oversee task-level support in transit analytics, a critical role, Marcus, especially during this onboarding window. The only thing that kept my expression intact was sheer disassociation. I nodded. Didn't speak. I needed them to think I agreed, that I saw the legitimacy in the handoff, that I was docile in defeat. They gave me 90 days to transition knowledge. 90 days to reverse engineer myself into someone else's brain. The worst part wasn't the lie, it was the silence. No one in that room said a word for me. People I'd trained, coworkers I backed in gray area cost reports, engineers who used my warehouse codes daily. Nothing. Their eyes never lifted. They took notes. They sipped lukewarm coffee, and I became a ghost in my own legacy. Back at my desk, someone had already updated the door placard. Ezra's name was printed just below mine, crisp and centered. Dual occupancy, which never happened before just now, when the point was to make it clear, old and new, overlapping until one faded out. Later that afternoon, Ezra dropped into my office like he hadn't just inherited my job, said something about how change is hard but necessary. I watched him cross his legs like a TED speaker and resist the urge to thank me for being so welcoming, and I almost laughed. Laughed because I remembered showing him how to fix his first malformed formula string just a month ago. Cell H14 had a syntax error, nothing major, just textbook beginner stuff. He'd stared at me like I was an oracle. Now he wanted to mentor me through redundancy. I smiled, tight-lipped. Told him I'd start pulling documentation off the shared drive for his review. That night, driving home was harder than usual. Every stoplight felt like a checkpoint testing my ability to not scream. My key fob skipped the sensor in the garage 3 times before it clicked, and I stood in the kitchen for a long while without taking off my jacket. My wife asked quietly, "How was it?" "Fine." I said it too quickly, my voice too even. She heard what I didn't say. I went upstairs, sat at my work desk, and unscrewed the cap off a bottle of Old Mech. It went warm without me noticing. I stared at the monitor as if it could spit out an answer. It didn't. It just returned the same folder list from earlier that day, files with my initials at the front. Audit logs, system reports. Time-stamped records of things no one cared about when they were inconvenient. That thumb drive in my coat pocket, I plugged it in, finally. Flicked through nested folders organized better than most team dashboards we'd rolled out. I'd kept it out of principle, foresight maybe. For years, I archived patterns, the deviations in inventory ledgers, mismatched freight logs, real costs of Janine's pet software build. I told myself I saved these things in case we ever got serious about fixing problems. Now, problems were all I had left, and suddenly they didn't look like burdens. They looked like leverage. I didn't go into the office the next day. Took a sick day, first one in nearly 2 years, and sat in the guest room that used to be my daughter's nursery, now more like a closet with nostalgia. I pulled the audit folders onto my personal laptop and clicked through them with fresh eyes, letting the data speak louder than my rage. There it all was, line after line. Inconsistencies buried in monthly logs, accounting tricks that only passed because no one ever audited beyond surface-level summaries, and logistics optimizations that shifted costs, never reduced them. Red flags so neatly categorized they'd practically wave themselves if printed. I wasn't angry anymore. I was lucid. There's a quietness in that moment when you realize revenge isn't about rage, it's about correction. I wasn't going to yell or rattle cages. I was going to fold the truth into their structure the same way they folded me out of it. Precisely, cleanly, without leaving fingerprints I couldn't claim later if needed. By lunch, I'd started on the deck. I pulled relevant screenshots, structured timelines, even added live-linked cells that updated cost overtime deltas in real time using the old freight dashboard Janine had neglected since budget season. The result was indisputable. Even Ezra would have understood it if he could sit still long enough. I labeled every slide like I always did: date, subtag category, audience relevance. It looked professional, sober, irrefutable. Then I took a walk to clear my head. Passed 3 playgrounds and couldn't stop thinking how if I'd cared half as much about office politics as I did about best practices, none of this would have blindsided me. But that's not who I am. I care about building things that work, not playing pretend in glass meeting rooms. That's why it stung so badly, because I thought excellence was the game. Turns out I was playing chess on a Monopoly board. Back home, I logged into the shared drive, still had full upload access. Ezra hadn't even bothered changing folder permissions, rookie oversight, but useful. They were building the pitch in a folder called Client Pivot Q2 Decks. I hovered over the pre-final version, triple-checked its timestamp, and created a duplicate. Renamed the duplicate with the same naming schema I'd always used, just minus the V5 at the end. Clean, indistinguishable from a legitimate version. I dropped my audit slides into that file, replacing the metrics appendix that Ezra's intern clearly patched together on Google Slides. Sloppy font consistency, no source data, and a month-old burn-in of the old company logo in the corner. It would have been embarrassing even if it hadn't carried falsified metrics I could disprove in under 5 minutes. I didn't change anything else. Left the rest of the deck intact. The cheery intro, the glossy photos of our outdated fleet, the inflated success projections, all Ezra's golden boy fingerprints still fresh. Just one misclick and the client would see exactly what we'd been burying. That night I cooked dinner, pasta with too much garlic and 2 glasses of wine. My wife knew not to dig. She watched me across the table like she knew something had calcified in me, something final. We didn't talk about work. I told her a story about a mechanic who chain-smoked and cursed like a pirate but could rebuild a carburetor blindfolded. Told her how that guy once said to me, "Nothing worth saving fights you this hard to fix." Funny how something that day became real. The next few weeks were strange. I resumed the charade Ezra expected: cordial, helpful, generous with time but never trust. I trained him in everything he asked, sprinkled with just enough ambiguity that he'd take assumptions back to Janine, thinking he'd inherited insight rather than guesswork. I noticed how much he still didn't understand. Line items on a freight quote he'd misread as discounts, a misinterpretation of fleet maintenance logs that skewed his resource plan by 13%. I let it slide, took notes. I knew the holes in his strategy cause I left them there like traps in plain sight. Janine, meanwhile, had started calling our check-ins leadership sinks. She spoke slower now, like I was a guest in a history museum exhibit that used to be mine. She asked questions about Ezra's potential, probably fishing for validation, but I kept it neutral. Lots of "he's learning" and "we're progressing." She never seemed to question how compliant I'd become. Ezra grew bolder. He dropped buzzwords like he'd earned them, threw around phrases like agile pivot architecture, even though we hadn't used a real agile framework since I floated the idea 2 years ago and it got buried under budget reallocations. He asked less about the why and more about the what to say, what to show. The pitch was all he cared about now, his proving ground. The closer we got to presentation day, the calmer I felt. I made sure to be in the background just enough, involved but unremarkable, always available, never insightful. I watched system logs, monitored file access timestamps, confirmed the client deck he used for dry runs had a path leading directly to my version. 3 nights before the pitch, I rechecked every slide. The embedded cost variance models, the inbound carrier failure rates, the screenshots of internal messages quietly stressing manipulated win metrics. It was, in a word, devastating, and it was already sitting in their main folder. All that needed to happen now was a single click. No fanfare, no access breach, just showtime. Thursday morning came quiet. I woke up at 6 like I always had, even though there was no reason to anymore. The house was still, my wife asleep, the hum of the fridge in the kitchen, the neighbor's dog barking once before going silent again. I sat at the dining table, not touching my coffee, just watching the light shift across the wall. My hands weren't shaking this time. Ezra had shared his final deck file the night before, timestamp 10:42 p.m., which told me he'd been up late tweaking transitions and maybe trying to memorize the talking points I'd spoon-fed him. All flash, no ballast. I smiled when I saw the file version. It matched mine perfectly, my dummy file name, his misplaced confidence. He never thought to double-check the actual content once he'd made it look presentable. I knew the pitch was happening at 10 a.m. Eastern, which meant I had just under 4 hours to wait. I didn't plan anything for the morning. No emails, no errands, I just existed. The way people do in waiting rooms before surgery or when pacing hospital corridors after a phone call they didn't expect. At 9:22, my phone buzzed a message from Jenna, one of the junior analysts I'd trained back before all this. She wasn't part of the demo team directly, but I knew she sat near the main conference room. They're in there. Ezra already spilled his coffee twice. Janine's in full blazer mode. I didn't reply. Instead, I pulled up the internal cloud dashboard on my laptop and opened the activity log. I wasn't supposed to have access anymore, but no one remembered to revoke rights to the analytics tracking sheet I'd built last year. Still logged. Still active. 20 minutes before the meeting, someone had opened the deck titled Client Pivot Q2 Decks Final. My version. I sat back and closed the laptop. 10 o'clock passed like honey through a sieve, slow and dense. Every tick of the clock in the hallway took seconds longer than it should have. I washed a few glasses, made toast, didn't eat it, scrolled through the local news, then stared at an old grocery list on the fridge. 7 years ago, that list would have read diapers, wipes, formula. Now it just said parsley. Somewhere between, I'd become someone they thought could be replaced. At 10:39, the phone rang. I hesitated for half a breath before answering. It was Jenna again, barely whispering. I could hear office noise behind her, chairs sliding, someone muttering something that sounded suspiciously like, "What the hell is this?" "I think," she whispered, "Ezra opened the wrong deck." My heart didn't leap or sink. It just steadied. "What happened?" I asked. They were walking through the metrics, right? And suddenly this slide pops up: shipment delay comparisons, cost balloons, annotated margin regressions. Janine blinked like 10 times. Ezra looked like the floor was about to eat him. The client, Frank Bauer from Northern Rail, he just stared. No one spoke for a full 30 seconds. Then Bauer said, "Is this accurate?" And my voice came out calmly, nearly bored. Janine tried to pivot, said something about error versions, draft files, but Bauer started asking questions. Pointed directly at one slide and said, "This contradicts your quarterly summaries." Ezra just froze. It was awful. Awful for them, maybe. What did they do? Bauer stood up and said, "This conversation is over." Then he left. Janine followed him out. Ezra looked like he was gonna throw up. "People are whispering. I think somebody called HR." "Thanks," I said. We didn't say goodbye. She hung up before I could. I imagined her sitting at her desk, pretending to click through reports while the storm worsened behind glass walls. I stood up, stretched, and felt more clear-headed than I had in weeks. The irony was sharp. After years of being meticulous, measured, methodical, all it took to unravel their entire bluff was pure visibility. They'd relied on polish. I used documentation. They fronted confidence. I delivered facts. By noon, another message came through, this time from someone I'd worked with in compliance a year back. "Hey, Janine on administrative leave. Ezra's profile inaccessible. You didn't hear this from me, but corporate is requesting a third-party audit. They asked for your name." I didn't respond immediately. I read the message twice, 3 times, like it might turn into a dream if I looked away. But it didn't. I opened my laptop again. The influx of notifications had started LinkedIn connections from people who once ignored me in Monday status calls, pings from old colleagues, whispers of respect disguised as curiosity. But none of that mattered. What mattered was what I hadn't done. I hadn't fabricated numbers. I hadn't hacked anything. I hadn't even lied. All I had done was show what had always been there. They asked me to train my replacement. So I did, right into a perfectly orchestrated collapse, and now the silence I once feared was theirs to hold. By Friday morning, the fallout was in full swing. The executive floor might as well have been on fire from what I gathered through the grapevine. Security escorts for Janine and Ezra weren't confirmed, but by noon their names had vanished from the internal messaging directory. Comms sent out one of those sterile emails about organizational adjustments to support strategic goals, but no one believed that nonsense anymore. Not after what had happened. My inbox, which had been practically silent for weeks, suddenly turned into Times Square on New Year's Eve. People I hadn't spoken to in over a year were just checking in or curious if I had time for a call. Some were pretending to offer sympathy, but I knew a fishing line when I saw one. Everybody wanted the story. I gave none of them what they came for. That afternoon, I got a formal message from corporate legal. Not accusatory, not friendly, just dry. "We'd like to discuss your involvement in a recent data presentation." I stared at the email for a full minute, then replied with a single sentence. "Let me know when and where." The counter-invite arrived within the hour. Monday at 11 a.m. Central. Formal, Teams call, camera on. That weekend came and went like fog. My wife noticed the shift kept checking in on me with cautious glances. We didn't talk about the details. Just watched movies, ordered Chinese food, and let the quiet settle around us. She placed her hand over mine during one scene and didn't let go. It said more than words ever could. Monday came sharp. I shaved. I wore a collared shirt even though I didn't need to. Sat at my desk with the blinds open and a glass of water in reach. When the time hit 11, I clicked join meeting and took a breath. There were 3 people on the call. A woman from corporate compliance, a man from internal audit who I half recognized, and a third who only introduced herself as deputy legal. Their faces were all business. No smiles. No small talk. The compliance officer kickstarted it. "Marcus, thank you for joining. Before we proceed, this session is being recorded and summaries will be distributed for record keeping. Do you consent?" "I do," I said. She nodded, then glanced at a notepad off camera. "We've reviewed the contents of the file shared during last Thursday's client presentation under the name Client Pivot Q2 Decks Final. We understand that slide deck appears to contain internal audit analysis linked to past logistics data that was not authorized for client viewing. Can you confirm whether you were the original author of that content?" "Yes," I said simply. "And can you explain how that deck became available in the shared drive folder used for client demo preparation?" "I uploaded it intentionally," I said without blinking. A tiny pause, pens scribbled in the background. "So to be clear," legal jumped in, "you substituted an internal document in place of a client-approved deliverable, knowing it would be accessed during a high-stakes proposal." "I didn't substitute anything. I labeled the file similarly. It was the team's responsibility to verify the content. That's standard protocol." The audit guy piped up next, tapping a key before speaking. "We cross-referenced everything that was presented. We believe the data was entirely accurate. In fact, several slides mirror the gaps we've been trying to surface for months." He adjusted his glasses. "Frankly, we're embarrassed it didn't come to light sooner. Legal didn't like that detour and brought us back. Intent aside, do you acknowledge this created reputational risk and contributed to the loss of a high-value client?" I waited for 2 seconds, then said, "You mean, did my accurate data cost you a contract that was chasing false numbers?" No one answered immediately. The compliance officer finally broke the silence. "Let's shift focus. Marcus, we'd like to discuss a new opportunity. Given your knowledge of the systems and analytics, we believe you may be able to support our new transparency initiative someone at your level would typically be overqualified for. However, after recent events, leadership strongly feels structural change requires input from the ground. We'd like you to come in as a contract consultant. 6 months initial, focus strictly on audit methodology and process integrity." I didn't answer right away. Just looked past the screen to the yard beyond the window where my kid's old tricycle sat half hidden in weeds. I thought of all the lost weekends spent correcting shipment records or navigating budget gymnastics meant to hide incompetence. Then I looked back at the blinking cursor next to my name. I'll review the offer, I said, but understand this, I work by one rule: truth speaks louder than optics. The audit guy nodded, the other two said nothing. The meeting ended 35 minutes later with promises of paperwork and NDAs. I logged off and closed my laptop. It didn't feel like a victory exactly, but it felt right. By Tuesday, the offer letter was in my inbox. Better compensation than I expected, full autonomy, direct access to the new oversight committee. No chain of command tying me to the people who had mishandled everything before, just truth, numbers, cause and effect, no more pretending. No more silence. I signed the offer Wednesday morning. There was no ceremony about it, just a click, a timestamp, and a return email from corporate saying they were glad to have me on board. No one called. No one scheduled a welcome meeting. I preferred it that way. I wasn't coming back to be part of a team. I was a scalpel now, not an appendage. The first few days under the new consultant contract were quiet. I had full systems access by noon Thursday and spent my time reviewing segments of the old audit trails, flagged now under the new transparency mandate. They were handing me the flashlight and asking where the rot was hiding. I didn't need much time to point. Some of the worst issues came from middle management. Fabricated efficiency reports, orders rerouted to save pennies while costing hours in delays, technician repair logs adjusted to look like upgrades. None of it surprised me. I'd raised questions on half this stuff before and had my concerns reframed as misplaced urgency. Now those same errors were flashing red in front of a committee that actually wanted to see them. Around the second week, I got a message from one of the directors, someone I'd never worked under. She scheduled a one-on-one with no description, just her name and a Zoom invite. I joined a minute early and waited under the lens, wondering what shoes she was about to drop. But when her camera activated, she just gave me a tired smile. "You're the reason we still have any credibility left," she said without preamble. I blinked. "Excuse me." She nodded. "They tried to hide the damage, said it was a tech failure, but your audit trail was timestamped and encrypted with verified identity metadata. We verified everything. You flipped the lights on. That's why I'm talking to you today." I didn't know what to say to that. I'd spent so long being dismissed or dismissed quietly that a straight-up acknowledgement felt almost surreal. She asked me a few questions about a legacy tracking system that had remained untouched for the past year, then thanked me for my time and ended the call. 10 minutes later, someone from internal systems reached out asking about my availability to help with a full process remap. Like that, I was inside the machine again, but this time with a sharper blade and the clearance to cut out disease instead of cover it. I won't pretend it felt like justice. Janine and Ezra had been removed, sure, but they weren't the only ones complicit. Culture doesn't start with one decision, it festers. The only difference now was that people were finally afraid of being seen. They were scrubbing reports properly, cross-checking claims with doc logs, even resurrecting outdated versions of software to re-verify buried metrics. Funny how fast accuracy becomes fashionable when someone drags the skeletons into daylight. One particularly slow afternoon, I found myself in our garden pulling weeds I had ignored since spring. My wife stepped outside with 2 mugs of iced tea and set one beside me without asking. She didn't ask how work was going. I think she already knew. Instead, we sat in the quiet, bees drifting near the lavender, and watched a patch of sunlight move across the fence. "I haven't seen you sleep this well in months," she said at one point, and I realized she was right. It wasn't about revenge anymore. Revenge had been the spark, but what followed was something else. I had clarity now. I saw my career not as a line that had been broken, but as chains I'd finally shed. I'd spent years helping others cover ground they never understood because I thought loyalty mattered more than visibility. Turns out, sight was the only real leverage I ever had. I got messages now from junior analysts in other branches. Not praise, not gossip, just data questions or, "Hey, I read one of your reports, can you help me understand this pivot table?" That felt more honest than any company mug or mandatory birthday card. It told me people were trying again, that maybe I wasn't just patching holes in a doomed ship. Maybe something could be rebuilt here. I never spoke to Ezra again. As far as I know, he disappeared quietly, another name added to the long list of corporate reshuffles. Janine took an advisory job somewhere out of state. Good for her. I never envied the kind of ambition that needed casualties to survive. By the end of the first month, the deputy legal officer reopened an invite chain review meeting. "No pressure," she said. Just updates. I joined, listened, answered 2 questions, then sat back while the committee debated a next phase framework based on my recommendations. They didn't thank me. They didn't need to. I wasn't there to be thanked. I was there to make sure no one went quiet again.